Hands go. All right. Well, this is lovely and great to see people, so many people in real time, in real life. I personally love that, especially the literary wine and cheese party. Can't wait to see that come back into fashion. I want to give a shout out and big thank you to OAR, to the Office of the Advancement of Research, and Remy and Dan Stageman. Where's Remy? I just saw her. I just met her. She's she's very busy. She pulls all this together, and and makes a lot of this possible. So thanks to OAR and the support for this incredible book, an opportunity. I'm Jean Mills. I'm chair of the English department, and I was asked to introduce Adam and our prestigious discussants. And I can't think of an easier assignment, and just a pleasure, because it's always a pleasure to work with you, Adam. But let me introduce Adam and his new book, Circulating Jim Crow. Dr. Adam McKible is an associate professor of English at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where we are right now. I see others from the surrounding areas as well, and other colleges. Welcome to John Jay. He is the author of Circulating Jim Crow. This just came out in 2024, as well as The Space and Place of Modernism, The Russian Revolution, Little Magazines, and New York. He edited and introduced Edward Christopher Williams's When Washington Was in Vogue, a previously lost novel of the Harlem Renaissance. He's also a co-editor of a special issue of Modernism Modernity, devoted to the Harlem Renaissance, and of the collection Little Magazines and Modernism, New Approaches. His current projects include a collection entitled Jim Crow Modernism and a special issue of the Journal of Modern Periodicals devoted to the Saturday Evening Post, about which we'll hear quite a bit today. And I hope, too, that we'll hear more about the new project and stuff, too, because it's fascinating stuff. I'm also going to introduce one of our discussants, Dr. Jessie Schwartz. She's a professor of English at LaGuardia Community College. Oh, sorry. I just met them.
I'm very fluent.
Nice to meet you. Okay, those are my spontaneous, organized remarks. There you go. If I put my glasses on, it might help. Jessie's a professor of English at LGCC, and a member of the faculty, the Committee of Globalization and Social Change at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is co-editor of the essay collection, New Directions in Print Culture Studies, Archives, Materiality, and Modern American Culture, and his work can be found there as well as in 19th century literature, English language notes, and a radical teacher. Awesome. He's currently at work. He's currently at work on America's Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution, Racial Socialism, and U.S. Print Culture, 1882 to 1929, which traces American cultural responses to transnational socialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries at the intersections of racial formation and radical politics. Welcome, Jessie, and thanks for being here. Our other discussant, Dr. Kelly Kreitz, is an associate professor of English and an affiliate faculty member in Latinx Studies at Pace University here in New York City, where she also serves in the Provost's office as the director of the university's Experiential Learning Initiative. Okay, we could talk about that too. Lots to talk about today. Her research on print and digital cultures of the Americas has appeared in Aztlan, American Literary History, American Periodicals, English Language Notes, and in her digital mapping project on New York City's 19th century Spanish language press, C19LatinoNYC.org. Her book, Printing Nueva York, Spanish Language Print Culture and the Literary Imagination in the Age of Electricity, is under contract with NYU Press. So welcome, speakers. We're going to hear from Adam about his new book. I have a signed copy. I know this isn't a buy and sign event. Is it? I don't know. Okay. But we're very much looking forward to hearing all the about the process and just about what we're learning today about the Harlem Renaissance and Saturday Evening Post. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right, microphone. I'm not good at these things. Thank you, Jean. So first I want to start by thanking Jesse and Kelly and Jean. Jean has been a real ally. She's the chair of the English department. She has a fabulous bookstore, upstate, Blue Heron Books, where it was one of the first readings I did for my book. Kelly and I worked on something called The City of Print. It was an NEH summer institute that was really generative, and I hope we can do it again. And Jesse and I go way back. He was my grad student back in the day, and is really doing fabulous work. And I'm pleased to know everybody up here. I also really want to thank everybody at OAR, but especially Remy, wherever you are here. She's done so much great work putting this together. Dan Stageman, thank you for really being an ally in all kinds of ways. And also, I want to thank Anthony Carpy, because when we were doing the grant writing workshop that Dan organized, Anthony said, write a 100-word description of your project, and that became this. In a very real way. I was able to write my grant proposal and crystallize the book in my mind, and I will really be forever grateful. So I want to give a quick overview of what the talk will constitute, and then we'll go. So first, I want to speak briefly about how I arrived at this project. Then I'll read a couple of sections of the book. One section of the book will sort of establish the audience of the Saturday Evening Post and the appetite that it was feeding for racist material. And the second, I'm going to dive into one of the authors that I focus on in the book. A note of warning, there will be some racist language, racist imagery. I'm not going to be able to get around it with this book. And I also want to say, as I begin, actually, I'll save that. So if I could have the next slide, please. Or am I doing that? Do I do that? I do that! No? No?
I got you.
Does it work? Which button do I push? Thank you. All right. So I'm not doing this to... When I started working in periodicals, I started working in little magazines, right? And so my first couple of books were on little magazines. And I brought a couple examples of little magazines with me just to show you. So these were small circulation magazines that were, they were printed in the hundreds, maybe the thousands, and had very small circulations at the time. So I did that work, and then right around that time, or after I finished that work, I had the realization that working with little magazines really didn't mean that I knew anything about magazines, because large magazines, large circulation magazines are so much different. So if I could have the next slide, please. So then I decided to move on to the Saturday Evening Post. Right, so I've got a few if you want to look later, but I mean, as you can see, little magazine, big magazine. And just to even give you a better sense, what the Post did in 1919 was they took one issue of the magazine and they put it into book form, codex form. Codex is the word for book. So they put it into codex form, and this is over 300 pages without any of the advertisements, without most of the illustrations. And so by working with the Saturday Evening Post, I figure I worked with about 1,000 of these. So then I moved on to the Saturday Evening Post, and I started with and that's George Horace Lorimer, he was the editor. I started with a genuine question. And my genuine question was, how did the Saturday Evening Post respond to the Harlem Renaissance? And it was an open question for me. And what I discovered shocked and horrified me, because I thought that what I would see is sort of like this extraordinary explosion of creativity influencing the Post in some ways that would be appreciable and shift it somehow, and it didn't. What I discovered instead was what I wound up calling a process of registering and recontaining black modernity. So what happens in the Saturday Evening Post, again and again and again, is it will portray examples of black modernity, black humanity, and then it will always package that back into the language and imagery of minstrelsy and plantation fiction, right? Again and again and again and again and again. And so I call that register and recontain. Registering a moment in history, recontaining it back into some earlier language. Just so for a quick example, black service in World War I. The 369th Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, were storied for their bravery, and you know, they earned all kinds of medals and stuff. And in the Post, for a hot second, they were registered as something worth paying attention to, but then very quickly they were reincorporated back into this older racist language and imagery. So that's what my book is about overall. I'll say one more thing and then I'll read a couple of selections. For this talk, I decided to focus really on the white supremacy aspects of this, of the magazine. Much of the book is also about how writers of the Harlem Renaissance responded to it, and we could talk about that in the Q&A, but for this talk, I really wanted to give you a sense of who's reading the Post, why are they reading it, one, and two, what's a good example of how this works. So I'll start with a passage from chapter 2. And this is about amateur minstrelsy. So if I could have the next slide, please. Once you start to look for minstrelsy, you see it everywhere in American culture. This ubiquity is true not only for the shows staged at all manner of public venues, including theaters, churches, schools, firehouses, and other public spaces, but also for in-home performances and recitations. Take, for example, the following social notice from the Downs, Kansas Times on May 13th, 1920. So that's the whole thing. Quote, "The Crescent Club met with Mrs. Charles Mann on Wednesday afternoon, May 5th. The program by Mrs. D.B. Harrison was one of the most entertaining programs given during the year. Mrs. Harrison brought out the pathetic superstitions and humorous characteristics of the Negro, giving first one of Viney's sketches, A Change of Heart, after which darky jokes were read by each member of the club. At the concluding number of the program, Mrs. Harrison gave a musical reading, the first banjo. During the social hour, we were served by the hostess to a dainty lunch." So first a little light racist banter, and then a dainty lunch. Mrs. Harrison, the hostess of this intimate gathering in a very small Midwestern town, bookended her Southern-themed party with two texts that must have been familiar enough to News and Times readers that their authorship required no mention. She concluded the event with Irwin Russell's much anthologized dialect poem, The First Banjo, and for her opener, she recited the monologue, A Change of Heart, which appeared in Blanche Goodman's booklet, The Viney Sketches, in 1919. If I could have the next slide, please. Although Mrs. Harrison almost certainly recited from this recent publication, monologues from the Viney Sketches had already been performed at similar gatherings around the United States for years, because all of Goodman's material in the booklet had initially appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. I'm not sure if I skipped a sentence, but so she read something written by this person, Blanche Goodman Eisendrath, who has been since lost to history for good reason. Blanche Goodman's role as a Post author is notable for at least two reasons. First, although Lorimer printed a considerable amount of material written by women during his editorship, the number of white female authors of black dialect fiction in the magazine can almost be counted on one hand. Goodman published 19 Viney monologues in the Post between 1908 and 1925, but this number is dwarfed by the publications of the white male authors Lorimer relied on for his regular doses of black caricature. But Goodman is notable for a second, potentially more revealing reason, namely that her life and work yield a great deal of information about how the Post was consumed and shared by readers, and about how an aspiring author might write and sell fiction catering to Lorimer's literary predilection for racist stereotype. Blanche Goodman gives us a glimpse into how white Americans read the Post, both silently and aloud. So just to contextualize, right, like Lorimer published a great deal of black dialect fiction written by white authors, most all men. She was the most published female author of this material. All right. Next slide, please. Goodman's monologues were read at large and small gatherings throughout the country. Evidence of the performative nature of Goodman's work is literally written into remaining copies of her inexpensively produced monograph, The Viney Sketches, which, by the way, if you want to see it later, got it. Where was I? Evidence of the 82-page booklet, which features two barely legible images of what appear to be black children on the cover, was, quote, reprinted by permission from the Saturday Evening Post. The Library of Congress has a photodigitized copy on its website, and in it, the first monologue, Book Raising, contains markings made in advance of a public reading. So you really can't see it, but there's a few little markings there. So somebody was going to read this in public. I was also able to obtain my own copy of the booklet, and it appears that someone named Dorothy Clare was scheduled to read from Helping Roosevelt, which was Goodman's first post-publication, on the forthcoming Saturday. So these cheap things were in circulation, and people were taking them to parties, and they were reading from them. Goodman achieved a measurable level of success by consciously becoming a black dialect writer for the Post. Because her monologues were written to be performed, they afforded her audience opportunities not only to laugh aloud with the humor of white supremacy, but also to perform intimate acts of racial love and theft. For example, at a Daughters of the American Revolution gathering in Tampa in 1919, quote, Mrs. T. Roy Young, disguised as an old Negro mammy, came to see her white folks, presenting each of the honor guests with old-fashioned nosegays and giving in her inimitable style a Negro dialect reading of a Goodman monologue. In El Paso, Texas, another monologue was read to kindergartners by one of their mothers at a school event in 1923. Imagine, for a moment, the emotional cathexis to a phantasmatic blackness experienced by the kindergarten child whose mother performed the Viney monologue at the front of the class. This was the readership and audience Lorimer was consciously developing as his image of American life. I want to insert a personal note here. As I researched the Post and read through a seemingly endless archive of predictable, interchangeable humor that repeats the same set of jokes, recycles a limited number of plot structures, and relies on the same two-dimensional characters, I often wondered why anyone would want to read this stuff again and again. Blanche Goodman and the success of her Viney monologues helped me answer this question by considering the broad demand for minstrelsy that Lorimer both shared and satisfied. Wanting to perform for each other, Post readers kept returning to predictable dialect fiction because they had an enormous thirst for material. Next slide, please. Goodman's writing was certainly read silently, but it was also read aloud in the privacy of families, in the intimate gathering of clubs, and at larger events such as recitals, school functions, and other public performances. Before, during, and after Goodman's publications in the magazine, and in addition to more prominent, longer black dialect fiction, Lorimer also incorporated brief, incidental racist jokes into his magazine for years. Such items were certainly meant for an immediate and perhaps silent chuckle, but they were also fodder for white Americans who wanted something to say at the office water cooler or at genteel gatherings such as those at the Crescent Club of Downs, Kansas, where, quote, darky jokes were read by each member of the club. These club women might very well have found Goodman's monologue and their jokes in the Post, or perhaps they gleaned their material from one of the booklets produced by minstrel paraphernalia suppliers such as Eldridge and Crest. So that's a cover from the magazine over there. I'll talk about that in a moment. And that was an advertisement from like the early 1900s for amateur minstrelsy supplies, amongst other things. Or maybe they stored away something they saw at an amateur or professional minstrel show. What Goodman shows us is that intimate performances of white supremacy were a regular feature of the American culture Lorimer strove to produce through his magazine. In the Laudatory Post article, Old Time Minstrel Men, the anonymous author and old-timer described the ecology of minstrelsy as a regularly refreshing source of material for everyday white Americans. Quote, Negro minstrelsy today has settled into a regular thing. People go to a show, enjoy it, memorize the gags, work them off with an unconscious and spontaneous air on less fortunate friends, and then wait for the return of the show to lay in a new supply. Readers of the Post, including Blanche Goodman, needed to wait only a few weeks at most for new gags because Lorimer made sure to lay in a new supply on a reliable basis. So that's sort of the world that Lorimer is both speaking to and creating, right? He's not neutral in this, right? He's making America in the image that he wants, and it's in America where minstrelsy is regular. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk briefly about. There we go. No, one more. There you go. Now I want to talk briefly about one of the authors that supplied this material regularly. His name was Hugh Wiley. Born in Ohio in 1884 and raised in Oregon, Hugh Wiley was drafted into the Army and served as a captain in the 18th Engineers in France. According to biographer John Tebble, he was a biographer of Lorimer, Wiley became one of Lorimer's closest friends. Quote, this lovable and provident man had gone to war in charge of a Negro labor battalion and come back to write the yarns about Negro crapshooters which Post readers enjoyed. It was the only kind of story he knew how to write, and he wrote it over and over with variations. The spontaneous crap game chatter he reproduced was hilariously funny to his audience. As Tebble accurately notes, Wiley wrote one story over and over with variations. And I would add over and over and over and over with variations. Pick a story from 1919, 1925, or 1934, and you are likely to encounter the same elements every time. Almost every story will touch on the Wildcat's excessive eating and drink. So I'm going to lay out some of the characteristics. Are there seats? No? Almost every story will touch on the Wildcat's excessive eating and sleeping. His diction will be mangled and his illiteracy emphasized. There will be at least one gambling scene, usually but not always a craps game, and the Wildcat will usually invoke Lady Luck at some point. And there's a whole book of that. Wiley also incorporated mockery of African American social organizations. Black women, if they appear at all, are almost always obese caricatures of the mammy figure. Finally, and most salient for my argument here, Wiley emphasized that his characters served with the American Expeditionary Forces, a point he drove home in almost every story by referring to the Wildcat's pet goat, Lily, a mascot he acquired in France. And so there you see the Wildcat with Lily. So the Wildcat becomes sort of the most familiar figure of the black veteran in this magazine for a couple of decades. To give this talk some coherence, I focus on the stories Wiley collected into his loosely constructed debut novel in 1920, The Wildcat, which comprises the first stories he published in the Post. Next slide, please. Wiley's first Post contribution, which will serve as an example for his whole genre, The Four-Leaved Wildcat, which was March 8th, 1919, begins in Memphis, where the improvident Marsden does just enough yard work to keep himself fed and in fancy shoes. Marsden is called up to the 1st Service Battalion, and after an unsuccessful attempt at dodging the draft, he reports for duty, is made a corporal, and is shipped to France. The military Wildcat, as he now calls himself, is, quote, pretty handy when there was any jobs of eating or sleeping to be done. So again, emphasizing laziness, gluttony, all this kind of stuff. After he arrives in France, the Wildcat stumbles through a series of self-serving schemes and various acts of unintended heroism. While in charge of transporting mules, he gets lost in no man's land and blunders upon some equally hapless German soldiers who promptly surrender. After delivering both mules and prisoners, the Wildcat goes AWOL, gets caught, and is about to be court-martialed. But the military brass learn of his exploits, and by the conclusion of the Four-Leaved Wildcat, Marsden is awarded the U.S. Distinguished Service Cross and the French Croix de Guerre, and is promoted to sergeant. And again, right, so Needham Roberts and I'm forgetting the other man's name. There are these two black soldiers who performed this extraordinary act of bravery. They, you know, by the time Wiley is writing, they're getting recontained back into these cartoonish, caricaturous ideas of blackness. Marsden's medals are almost certainly intended to spoof the Croix de Guerre awarded to Henry Johnson and Eden Roberts for their valor. In other words, everything that befalls the Wildcat in Wiley's first story happens by chance, not by intention or choice, implying that African Americans' military valor in Europe was only ever aberrant or accidental. In the subsequent stories shaped into Wiley's first novel, the Wildcat concocts a scheme to hire out Senegalese soldiers as laborers to French farmers and the U.S. Army, accidentally foils a U-boat attack, sojourns with jazz bean-eating cannibals in Africa, becomes a brief dance sensation back in France with the aid of those jazz beans, and settles the peace process by turning an overhead fan into a roulette wheel. With the war over, he returns to the States, where he is duped by Italian gamblers and a black con man in Manhattan, and then travels across country as a waiter on the train until he finally returns to Memphis. So it's all really picaresque, and right, you know, it's all just done for the humor in quotations. All of these events, the encounter with an unwanted draft, the performance of valor in the field, the exposure of African Americans to both Africans and internationalism, the development of jazz in Europe, and the economic plight and ensuing rootlessness of many returning servicemen after the war. All of this is recast in the familiar tropes and languages of the all too familiar Saturday evening Post dialect story. Just a little bit more. Okay, so for 25 years, Wiley churned out depictions of African Americans as objects of humorous derision, and his stories exemplify generally the predictable dialect fiction of America's predominant national magazine, and specifically that magazine's dismissive treatment of black veterans. So generally, right, the dialect, and specifically what he's doing with black veterans. Following the success of his initial stories and first novel, Wiley sent his protagonists across the country and all over the globe. Indeed, the Wildcat not only circulated widely in the pages of Lorimer's magazine, but was a well-known and beloved figure in the United States almost from the start. Glowing reviews followed the publication of each of Wiley's novels, and the Wildcat, and sometimes his pet goat Lily, were quoted with loving pleasure in the white press. I feel like I want that in. Could you go back one slide? No, back one. Yeah. I don't want to leave that there for a minute. The Wildcat also caught the attention of the film industry. This is one of the things that really surprised me when I was doing my research. In January 1920, the Los Angeles Times announced that it was in negotiations with Wiley to bring Vitus Marsden to the screen. These negotiations with Burt Williams, some of you might know that name, these negotiations appeared to fizzle out. In 1923, Al Jolson also came very close to performing The Wildcat as his first movie. The Salt Lake Tribune reported that Jolson was going to drive from Chicago to the Southwest, where he would work on a movie featuring the Wildcat. Plans for this movie were apparently well developed. According to the San Francisco Examiner, Jolson will use troops of the 10th Cavalry to give the proper military atmosphere to the film recital of Vitus's experience in France. These plans must have fallen through, though, but in 1930, the Pathé Film Studio brought out the two-reel talkie High-Toned, which stars the black vaudeville duo Buck and Bubbles. And I'm sorry if I I took a big pencil to a lot of my books so I can make it like listenable rather than readable, so I have to jump around a little bit. In other words, the Wildcat made Hugh Wiley a household name in Jim Crow America, especially in the 2 or 3 million homes receiving the Saturday Evening Post every week. But as Peter Rollins and Harry Menig note, quote, the sheer volume of Wiley's stories indicates that Post readers never tired of reading about the Wildcat's misadventures. Because of his fame, Wiley was enlisted by the Associated Oil Company in 1927 for a national advertising campaign to promote ethyl gasoline. Images of the Wildcat and Lily ran throughout the country. So there are scores of these advertisements in papers throughout the United States. So this is how much of a household name Hugh Wiley was at the time. White America loved Hugh Wiley's humor. Upon the publication of the Wildcat in book form in 1920, Irvin S. Cobb, who was another white author of Black Dialect for the Post, Irvin S. Cobb wrote, quote, Hugh Wiley not only knows the modern Southern Negro, but knows how to put him down in black and white. Most admirably, he has done this in that book of his, The Wildcat, every page of which abounds in racy humor. Not wanting readers to miss his pun, Cobb concluded by pointing out, in this connection, I use the word racy advisedly. Like Cobb, whose work disavowed anti-black violence while undergirding, I have to explain that. All right. So what Cobb did, and a lot of these authors would do, is they would sort of like, they would deny the violence undergirding this work on the regular basis. They would promote it, and they would deny its violence. Like Cobb, whose work disavowed anti-black violence while undergirding the ideology and oppression of Jim Crow, Wiley's humor was never far from that violence. Wiley conceived of himself as a white boss demanding fealty from his inferior. In a widely reprinted story in late 1921, Wiley claimed, quote, my Wildcat has begun to act a little uppity. A short session in Louisiana and Tennessee will learn him how to act in the presence of white folks, end quote. Wiley's creation might roam far and wide, see the world and all its many customs, but he would never stray too far from the discipline and subservience expected of him by readers of the Saturday Evening Post. So now the last slide, please. A particularly chilling reminder of the racial terrorism that always existed just below the surface of white-authored black dialect fiction can be found in a Kentucky newspaper. On December 17, 1925, 1 month after the publication of the Wildcat story, Sick Percent, that was the name of the story, the Knoxville Journal ran an advertisement for a local bank that quotes extensively from the story using its, quote, amusing plans of Wildcat from the imagination of Hugh Wiley in the Saturday Evening Post to sell bonds. And I don't have to read what it says, but it reproduces the dialect. On the same page as this jovial advertisement, a journal headline announced, Negro lynched for insults, riddled body as answer to remarks to a white woman. The victim, Grant Cole, was shot to death in Montgomery, Alabama, quote, near the spot where earlier in the evening he was alleged to have insulted and abused an unnamed white woman. Wiley's joke about sending his character back south because he has begun to act a little uppity was never far in its attempt from the terrorism that led to Cole's murder for refusing to run an errand for a white woman. So that's a couple of selections from the book, and I'll end it there.
Thanks so much, Adam, and thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to be here in conversation with Adam and also with Jesse, and looking forward to the conversation with all of you. I'll just give a little bit of background of how I ended up here. I first met Adam in 2015 at the City of Print Summer Institute that he mentioned, and then more recently in 2020, we worked together with Mark Noonan, who is also here, to help to organize that institute. Back in 2015, I was in my first year on the tenure track at Pace, downtown, and it was my introduction to periodical studies, which became a major influence on my approach to my research on 19th century U.S. U.S.-based Spanish language print culture, especially in New York City. So it's from that perspective that I'll bring some thoughts to the conversation today. And just maybe make one other observation about how much I appreciate the energy that I sort of feel from Adam in this work and just in the periodical studies field in general, maybe a necessary energy because of the massive undertaking it is to study these magazines, which I think is really evidenced in Adam's impressive book. I hope we can maybe bring that into the discussion, which I'm eager to get to. So I'll limit my remarks to 3 themes that I thought about as I read the book, and I'll try to offer up some thoughts and also questions for each one. And Adam, those could be questions for you, or we could sort of take them into the audience discussion, depending on what you would prefer. So the themes are editorship studies, thinking about Latinx modernism's conversation that has been growing over, I would say, the past 5 to 10 years, including at the Modernist Studies Association conference recently in Brooklyn. So I'll say a little bit about that, and then do a little bit of reflecting on what we might call recovery work versus reckoning work, which I think this book raises some questions about as well, in productive ways. So I'll jump right in and start with editorship studies. I was interested in this idea of the editor as dictator, which comes up in the book as really how George Horace Lorimer approached his editorship of the Saturday Evening Post. And it made me think about work in editorship studies that 2 other graduates and participants in the City of Print Institute have done over the years, Jim Casey and Sarah Salter, who have theorized editorship as a site of, quote, illuminating the role of periodical publishing and serial media more broadly in building communities across different nations, languages, and historical periods. So for me, thinking about late 19th century and early 20th century Spanish language publishing in New York City, editorship exemplifies what Casey and Salter describe as, quote, a practical way for marginalized groups to develop collective and collaborative forms of expression. And I'm particularly interested in the Spanish language press, which was very active here, as I'm sure many of you know, in the 19th century, especially around organizing for Cuban and Puerto Rican independence, in how editors really, through collaborative teams, often teams that debated with each other, built worlds that they were seeking to realize through print. And in such a context, they really exemplify what Casey and Salter have noted as editorship like community as something that is always a work in progress. So we see in Adam's analysis of the Saturday Evening Post that it is true that Lorimer perfected a vision over time, but it was really his vision imposed. It seems very different to me, perhaps a way of understanding mass media versus smaller DIY publications or little magazines. So I'd be interested to hear how, Adam, how you think about this in relation to the little magazines, just thinking about editorship. Okay, so moving on to my second theme, I'm also thinking about how Circulating Jim Crow might help us to rethink or recognize the diversity and complexity of modernism in the context of recent discussions in Latinx studies about whether there is a Latinx modernism in the United States. And this is where I'll say that as someone who primarily focuses on the 19th century, I didn't come to modernist studies. I feel like modernist studies came to me because I really had started by writing about Latin American modernismo, which scholars have initially described as a kind of romantic movement. But increasingly, there has been conversation about how we might look at the publications, literary magazines in the United States. I look at publications in New York City, like La Revista Ilustrada de Nueva York, New York Illustrated Magazine, that we might also think of as a Spanish language modernism that arrived in the United States, maybe even before Anglophone modernism. And what's interesting to me about that potential modernism, this is a debate, is that it's really not one movement. And in fact, there's a lot of difference between the late 19th century modernismo and then kind of various more dispersed publications of the early 20th century, anarchist publications like El Despertar, The Awakening, publications like Gráfico, because there really was a community of people who left in 1895 to fight the war in Cuba, and some did not come back. And but so there's a kind of ununified school, but a thread that runs through that Latinx modernism, if we want to call it that, that is really about envisioning a more just world. That coalition, as has been widely discussed, surrounding José Martí in the late 19th century that was fighting for Cuban and Puerto Rican independence, in its best moments was multiracial and really envisioning a future of Cuba and the Americas that is yet to come. So I'd be interested in thinking as well about how Adam's book might help us to think about Latinx modernisms alongside Harlem Renaissance modernism as maybe various ways of seeking to use modern media to mediate and bring about new worlds, and then also nightmare worlds like the one here. So that's something else that I'll put out there. Along with that, I think when we're looking at different forms of modernism, they come along with different forms of the literary. So that could be something that we think about as well. And then finally, just to end on this note of recovery work versus potentially reckoning work, I spend a lot of my time thinking about an archive that Rodrigo Lasso has described as dispersed, fragmented, and incomplete. So the work of identifying a Latinx modernism is about finding, it's about finding sort of lost, incomplete projects. And that, I think, is an important part of not just understanding modernism, but understanding the diversity and complexity of print culture in general. Alongside that, it seems like this work of reckoning with the major publications that were circulating the stereotypes, the racism, the justification of Jim Crow, has to be done as well. So just thinking a little bit about how those two projects might work in tandem with each other if our ultimate goal is really maybe making modernism unrecognizable from its more canonical forms. I'll just note as well that one of the things that scholars talk about in Latinx studies is that there are some forms of modernismo that are really invested in a kind of literary autonomy that I think we know and associate with Anglophone modernism, but there are other forms that are really much more experimental, and literary value is much more about social justice. So we could think a little bit about maybe there are multiple modernisms that actually define multiple forms of the literary as well, and how might that change some of our conversations. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Should we let
Oh,
Jesse go?
you're gonna address those, can you hold that space? You have to have 3 main points you just made. As long as you can hold on to it.
I'm taking notes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Jess.
Okay, thank you. And there's a lot of great crossover, I think, between me and Kelly's comments. But first, I also, of course, want to thank John Jay, the English department, Jean, Kelly, my correspondent, and I especially, of course, want to thank Adam. I have no doubt I was his very first 7th choice, so I am very flattered to be here. And speaking of Adam, because he and Kelly have already spoke about the book in more incisive ways than I would ever do, my opening remarks will be a little more untraditional, as Adam intimated, and a little more personal, as I want to focus first on the writer and the person behind the book, because I would argue in many ways, and if you know Adam, the publication of Circulating Jim Crow completes a substantial part of his career that I think should be both publicly marked and celebrated. And also because we so often focus on the sparkling and seamless object before us rather than the maker who toiled, in this case, for very hard, and for very long to make it so. So to make he and I both feel older, I have to take us back about 18 years to 2006, when as a newish PhD student at the CUNY Graduate Center, I walked into a classroom where some guy who happened to be the professor immediately started talking about something he called periodical studies. And I will confess to being both a little skeptical and a little bored. The old newspapers, long-vanished magazines, other serialized ephemera, still in my 20s at the time, this seemed to be the very opposite about what was hip and sexy in the discipline of English at the time. But 18 years later, and thanks most of all to his mentorship and friendship, I'm also now a tenured CUNY professor who's now also published or edited essays and volumes within, you guessed it, periodical studies, and so I have to praise him publicly here, because if you know Adam, you also know he won't do it. Oh, and as Jean said that I was the co-editor of the New Directions in Print Culture Studies, I didn't know he would be here when I sent the bio, but the co-editor is right there, Daniel Worden, so I do have to give him a shout out. He's sitting right behind Professor Gray. So, in the same vein, I also want to discuss the methodological rigor and stamina Adam brought to his book, because he also won't do that himself. In fact, I would argue that the only thing Adam isn't good at is self-promotion, which makes him a severe rarity in our business. So for those of you here that have never read an issue of the Saturday Evening Post from the time period that Adam covers, essentially that of George Horace Lorimer's editorial reign from 1899 to 1936, first, well done. And second, you blissfully have no idea how much time and effort and just stomach it takes to get from the front cover to the back of just one of these issues. First, they are endless. We are talking 150-ish pages per issue, small print, while the quality of the stuff inside is wildly variable, rarely exceptional, and also willfully and plottingly middlebrow in the worst definition of that term. A rough and most likely conservative estimate I made of the output during Lorimer's time as editor, though bear in mind I'm in the humanities and not math, was that the Post published over 250,000 pages, at least, that Adam in some manner made his way through, sometimes skimming or word searching, sure, but often reading every word outright. Beyond sheer mass, though, and as I think his talk made very clear, much of what's in there, especially if you're looking for works that engage with the racial politics of the time, is simply repugnant. And it kind of becomes, as you saw, right, it's this endless catalog of casual slights, vapid racist paternalism, goofed stereotypes, and often just outright bilious racism of the most venomous sort. In fact, when Adam was deep in the writing of this book a couple years back, we met for dinner, and he looked a little out of it. So when we talked about the project, the toll it was taking on him and what he might move on to next, he sighed, anything, as long as it doesn't involve the Post. But now I want to expand the frame a little. Adam's heroic efforts here also map more broadly onto his do-gooderism in the other fields, in the broader fields that he touches. In addition to turning on countless students to periodical studies, Adam is important in and for the field of African American modernism as well, and his institutional work within the Modernist Studies Association, the field's premier scholarly organization, is in many ways an answer and an angry rejoinder to the Post itself. He has long been part of a shockingly small cabal of scholars that have toiled for years at the incremental and still shockingly hard labor of making works by black authors at the very center of modernist studies, both objectively and theoretically, rather than, as has far more often been the case, supplements, peripherals, or tokenist expansions of some fantastical canon of the quote-unquote high modernism of, say, Pound, Eliot, and Fitzgerald, which he and others, through their work, have time and again shown to be, in the words of a far more contemporary black artist, somewhat high on their own supply, or at least in their subsequent scholarly champions. This toiling largely without recognition continues in Adam's work as a mentor when it comes to his best, or at least most demanding students. Adam has never once worried about self-promotion, jealousy, or protecting his territory. For example, when I began to research similar topics in the Post for my own dissertation years ago and asked him where I should start to look, he just gave me all of his detailed reading notes, distilling what I'm sure were the results of hundreds, if not thousands of hours of corneal damage spent in front of a microfilm machine into a searchable document that he just casually emailed me as if RSVPing to a party. And I'm saying this all again here publicly because he won't and doesn't, and also for too long we celebrate and cite the work of vainglorious monsters, endlessly grasping for renown at the expense of students and colleagues alike, while scholars like Adam get what I would argue is shorter shrift because they're too busy helping others warmly and quietly rather than fluffing themselves up, the scholarly equivalent of a dad joke in human form. And so I thank him again for the opportunity to say this publicly, but before I get teary, let's move on to some comments about the book itself. And so as Adam so extensively and eloquently points out, the world of Jim Crow was famously a system of law and culture, of course, a custom, of course, but it was also, like Said's famous argument about Orientalism, right, a quote-unquote textual relation, a discursive fabric that structured and gave order and form to the belief and actions that Jim Crow demanded for its reproduction. So I'm wondering, one periodical studies guide to the next, how you see this work of seriality, right? Repetition really seems to be the modality of art here. And the need for constant iterativity functioning in the Post and periodicals more broadly around Jim Crow. In other words, these are not lessons once learned, but constantly, almost desperately reinforced. Also, working on this, I was thinking again about James Smethurst's incredible book on the African-American roots of modernism, where I think he persuasively argues that many of the tropes that were supposedly the province of high modernist strategies of representation, alienation, internal dualism, the effects of urbanization and industrialization on contemporary life, and the increasing human difference that resided within, were, if not solely conceived beforehand by African-American artists, were certainly foregrounded in their literatures well before, and led to their reworkings in the poems, plays, and fictions of far more better-known white modernists later on. This is admittedly a bit of a long setup to ask in the manner that Bill Maxwell's FBI so gorgeously shows the sort of, if not full-on dialectical, at least mutually constitutive relationship between FBI agents and black literature, how the themes and tropes of literature, of African-American literature, were taken up in the Post by white authors, only to be, in your words, registered or recontained. And similarly, if you could speak a bit more about how the black writers, necessarily publishing elsewhere, responded to these caricatures of their supposed selves in the pages of the Post. And finally, just because there's a lot of students here, which is great, I want to know what your secret is. Whether the Post itself, because of the sheer mass of text, and now that you're taking a well-earned leave from it, at least when you finish that special issue, what directions do you think would be most fruitful or vital in terms of future scholarship on the Post for current researchers, grad student curious? What aspects of its role and importance in American culture remain to you most central and yet also most unexplored? And in that vein, and I think Kelly was talking about this, right, the energy of periodical studies in general, what's exciting to you about the field right now? But, you know, I want to just end by saying that, right, as we know, these are not good times. But Adam is certainly a very good guy who wrote a very good book that, as his epilogue makes terrifyingly clear, clearly addresses our very bad times. And I hope he can speak to that, too.
I'm just going to go now. I don't know how I follow that. I guess I'll try to make this quick because I hope we can get to some questions, but I do want to try to answer some things as best as I can. I guess I want to start with how I met Jesse and what I put him through. And the class. You all can hear me? Yeah. All right. So the class, this was 2006. Was it 2006?
I thought it was 2006.
Something like that. And it was the class was on modernism and racial pseudoscience, right? And so I wanted to give the students a sense of what the period was actually like. And this was at the beginning of my interest in the Saturday Evening Post. And so I assigned each student in the class 1 year of the Post to report back on. At this point in the history of the Post, it was only available on microfilm. A, only. And B, what I didn't realize, so I had a former student of mine who did a little bit of work scanning through some of the Posts, but just a really quick job. What I didn't realize was that, so the Post in the early 1900s was 34, 60 pages, something like that. But during the really fat years, like in the 1920s when the economy was good, a single issue could be 250 pages, right? So these poor graduate students had to scroll through the Saturday Evening Post, so like whoever got 1912 or whatever was very happy, and whoever got 1925 was miserable. But that does speak to, but it turned out to be such a great class that it led to this book. Like I don't think I was really thinking along those lines until my students helped me to understand what was there. Since then, so I looked through, to Jesse's point about my corneal damage, I looked through every issue of the Saturday Evening Post from about 1890-something to 1930-something. I looked through every issue on microfilm, which was, it was hours and hours and hours of work with like this stuff scrolling by, and I could only do it for a few hours at a time because I would like literally get kind of like sick, and after a while it's just like, it's physically demanding. Later on, the Happy Trust, which digitizes a bunch of stuff, they put a bunch of, whatever was available, they put that up. The problem with the Happy Trust is it's a very slow website, so like you try to read things and like it just takes forever to load. But much more recently, the Saturday Evening Post itself digitized everything. And so I am kind of thinking, how can I teach with this thing, which I might want to do. So that's the process in the class. Let me try to answer, I think, Kelly's ideas first. So editing. Yes. I'm not as up on the most recent, but basically, George Horace Lorimer was a dictator of his magazine, right? And there were editors that worked this way. There are other editors who did not work this way, and so like you can't read the same kind of intentionality that you like that you might read in a little magazine or a magazine that has a more, let's say, functional or a board of editors or whatever. So my example is going to be the Liberator, right? So Liberator was a little magazine published mostly in the teens and 20s, and it had a rotating cast of characters who edited it, and whoever was editing the magazine at that time or was most in charge, that would reflect what was going on in the magazine, right? But Lorimer, iron grip, 30-something years. The magazine was always evolving and never changing. So it really depends upon which magazine you're looking at for how you conceive of an editor, and it makes a difference. I'm glad you brought up Smethurst. I don't know if I have a good, this response to both of you in a way, maybe. About Latinx modernism. Just thinking about the Post in particular, it was really obsessed for a long time with Mexico in particular. So I could really see somebody doing important work there. The writing is not modernist, it's trudgingly middle brow, and it's completely reactionary, right? But it might be interesting, like pairing that up, say, with John Reed, who also went to Mexico and did, right? That's your work. It did interesting stuff there. I love what you said about modernism, Kelly, and social justice. One of I got this more from the work that I did. Actually, no, this came from the Post. I think during the era of modernism itself, like if we talk about it as being in the past, for most Americans, modernism meant Gertrude Stein, and it meant Claude McKay, and it meant anarchism, and it meant cubism, and it meant women's, the suffrage movement. It meant all of those things. The modernism that developed, that crystallized in the American Academy in the middle of the 20th century, the high modernism that we take as modernism, is very much an after-the-fact construction of what was really going on, right? So there were modernists who were very much interested in formal experimentation, right? T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, right? People who are working in fragmented stuff, or like, the Cubists and the way they're painting, all that's is certainly modernism. But really, also, I think a lot of Americans thought of the IWW as a manifestation of modernism also, right? So that's the kind of recovery. So I love this idea of recovery versus reckoning, right? Because I think we are still in the process of recovering the fullness of modernism and the fullness of modernity, and taking it back from the mid-century reactionaries, right? So how does modernism enter into the academy? Well, one of the ways it enters, right, is through the agrarians. The agrarians. So there's this group of Southerners. They were called the fugitives, and they became the agrarians. And basically, they were just advocates for Jim Crow in fragmented poetry, right? That's what they were doing. That's what they were doing. But they became the professors who instantiated modernism into the academy. And so we are claiming that back. And so part is recovery and part is reckoning, right? We can't, I had a conversation once. I think about this all the time. I had a conversation once in grad school with this guy, fellow grad student, and I was like, gosh, these modernists, they sure seem conservative. and he said, yeah, that's just the nature of poetry. And it's not. It's not the nature of poetry. It was the nature of who built this thing that got handed down to all of us. So we're still in the process of fixing that. A few more things. Seriality. And then I'll try to show you. Seriality. When I think of the Saturday Evening Post and its constant reiteration of stereotype and caricature, right? I mean, constant. And sometimes I just like had to step up. Sometimes it was really sickening to read this stuff, right? Example, I mean, once I read one of these little, it was just meant to be a humorous little bit in the magazine, and it was telling a joke that was told by the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States, and it was a joke about lynching. And it turned my stomach, because like he was one of the most powerful people in the United States. So seriality. I mean, for me, I don't think this is a cheap shot, but like, you know, how does Fox News work? It repeats the same thing over and over and over again. And I use Fox pretty consciously because in the 1920s, the Saturday Evening Post was mailed to 2 to 3 million households, right? If you multiply that by 3, which is sort of the standard operating principle for when you take circulation, you multiply it by 3 to get a more accurate number of how many people would read a magazine. That's like 10 million people. That's 10 million people in a nation at that point about 130 million, right? So almost 10%. Now, Fox News, for example, I think they get about 2 to 3 million viewers a night. So just like the power of the Post, the repetition of this Jim Crow ideology, of this, right, was just powerful. I'll save the black writers for last. Future scholarship. I'll just speak about the Saturday Evening Post in general. There's so much that can be done, right? Like, I know Jesse's working on sort of like the way that Russia and Bolsheviks were reported on. And there's a whole, I kind of started down that road, and Jesse's picking it up, and I'm thankful for it. But you can do so much of that. There's a whole body of work on Asian American stereotypes, of Latinx. I mean, it's all there, and none of it's been written about yet, right? And I think there's much more work that could be done. And there's all kinds of other work. Like someone named Jennifer Nolan is doing this really interesting work looking at the way that Fitzgerald is published in the Post and how you read the images against the language. There's all kinds of stuff that can be done. And so finally, black writers, and then I'll stop. So there are no black writers in the Post between the early 1900s and after Lorimer dies, right? When they publish a story by Zora Neale Hurston. And there are direct references to the Post, but a lot of it is like, they'll take up the same kind of idea, right? So, for example, in my chapter on minstrelsy, right? Where it's all just fun, right? But then if you look at Charles W. Chestnut's The Marrow of Tradition, does anybody know this book? Right? Marrow of Tradition, it's about the riot that happened in Wilmington in 1898, where white supremacists took over the local, it was a violent coup. It was January 6th, but it succeeded, right, on the local level. And the character that sort of gets it all started is this white son of a local gentry who puts on blackface and murders his aunt so he can pin it on, right, like this black character, right? So and then Ann Petrie, who's writing a little bit after this, writes about in her book The Narrows. I think it was in The Narrows. I think I'm trying to remember. But she writes about a black character who goes to Rockefeller Center and sees the Christmas play, except it's got two minstrel performers on stage, and it like re-traumatizes him from stuff from his own youth. Or the chapter on Hugh Wiley, which is really all about just undermining the heroism and humanity of African Americans. I pair that up, soldiers, I pair that up with When Washington Was in Vogue, which was this novel that I discovered from the Harlem Renaissance, where the main character is a returning veteran who is, you know, intelligent, well-read, a human being. He's a human being. And so, you know, that's one way. And so writers are always responding. One more example, because I like this one. One of the other authors I write about is a man named Octavius Roy Cohen, who is probably the most successful author of this stuff, successful in the sense that he published the most. He created a black movie company, fictionalized a black movie company, and he sent them to Europe, right, for all their hijinks there. And I write about that in the book. And you know, around the same time, Langston Hughes does go to Russia on a boat, right? He travels to Russia with a bunch of black activists and artists, and they were going to make a movie in Russia. It never happened, but they were going to make it. So these are the kinds. So the conversation is almost never direct, but it's there. I mean, there are examples of direct, like Booker T. Washington weirdly writes to Lorimer and congratulates him for publishing something racist.
That's on brand.
My jaw dropped when I read it. Du Bois wrote to him. Du Bois wrote to Lorimer and said, "Could you stop this?" And Du Bois is like, or Lorimer's like, some of my best friends are black. You know? So, you know, on and on and on it goes. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, anybody have questions from the audience? I have a ton of questions I could ask, but go ahead.
Could we ask, sorry, if you have questions and you're able to, can you go to the mic at the center here? And if you are mobility impaired and not able to make the mic at the center there, we will bring it to you. So just raise your hands. But if you are able to do that, go ahead and line up at the mic in the center.
Hi. Nice to meet you. My name is Zora. I'm visiting from Columbia Law School. I'm a second year there. I'm friends with Remy. She invited me here today. Yeah, so I had two questions for you. One, I'm really curious about the origin of the Evening Post, like because of the repetition and because of, I feel like the amount of households it was reaching, I felt like maybe this is government sanctioned in a way, or was it really just private individuals saying we want to collect these stories and share them with people? I'm curious about that, if it was government sanctioned in some way. And my second question for you was about who you feel like the intended audience of this book is now, like in today's world, I think. Like, I'm thinking, are you hoping for people who are not familiar with Jim Crow history to get a sense of how it has become entrenched in the US? Or are you hoping to share with people who are new to the US, like why they're seeing some of the things today that people say, oh, happened so long ago? I'm just curious about what you want the impact to be from this.
Those are great questions. So,
Thanks.
about, this was not a government organ, but it was kind of government adjacent, right? Like, I mean, Lorimer was a very powerful, when he died, like, there was a paper about him being sick, there was about a story rather about him getting better, about him dying, about his funeral, about his will, right? So he was a hugely important person in America, but he was not affiliated with the government except through his connections, right? But when Republicans were in power, Republicans mostly, when Republicans were in power, he was closer to power because of that, right? You know, like one of his early contributors, important contributors, this man Alfred Beveridge, was a U.S. congressman. And if you go to Philadelphia, so it's, again, not government, but if you go to Philadelphia today and you go to the Curtis building where this stuff was published, it is a gigantic, is that neo-colonial? It's just with columns and it's humongous and it's right pretty much much next to the Independence Hall. So Lorimer was always close to power and had power, but not governmental power, right? Does that make sense? Who do I hope? I mean, I wish everybody would read my book. It would be nice. I mean, I guess I think of it as an academic book that will be primarily read by other people working in periodical studies, in African American literature. Oh, it's better? Oh, okay. African American studies. I remember, actually, I think she's here, Anna Marie was here, asked me, you know, like, what do I want this book to accomplish? I just want to tell the truth, right? You know, I don't know if my book by itself can do anything, but I want to leave an accurate record of the past that has been covered up. And in fact, I'll just say one more thing about this. So the book I just sent off to the publisher is called Jim Crow Modernism, and it's a collection of essays by a bunch of scholars on Jim Crow modernism. And the central argument of that book is that we should not think of American modernism as anything other than Jim Crow modernism. Like all American modernism, between Plessy versus Ferguson to Brown, and probably before and after, should be considered Jim Crow modernism, right? That, like the idea that the American regime of racial segregation shaped every aspect of American experience and culture and its arts, right? So one of the things that comes out to me from putting that book together is that Jim Crow was very good at covering its tracks, at sort of doing its terrible work in plain sight and then sort of like erasing it at the same time. So I want to unerase that as much as I can. So you know, it makes a nice birthday present.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So first of all, thank you. I've not finished the book, but I'm about 35 pages in, so it's I can report. But I have a particular question, because you were talking about this this containment that the Saturday Evening Post was doing, and it makes me think constantly about February 19th, 1919, when the Harlem Hellfighters marched up Fifth Avenue, right? And so this march, the March of the All-Black Harlem Hellfighters, has been heralded by, oh my goodness.
Ken Burns.
No, not by Ken Burns, by Du Bois's biographer.
Oh, Rampersad?
Yeah, Rampersad says that this is the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. Like the Harlem Renaissance begins with the march of the Harlem Hellfighters up Fifth Avenue to Harlem, right? So my question, since you've read the entire thing, how does the Saturday Evening Post respond to this, you know, 5,000 black men proud walking up Fifth Avenue, marching up Fifth Avenue in uniform? These are heroes of the war. Like, what's the response of this? How do they contain this quite spectacular event? So.
Quick answer, by ignoring it. Seriously? Oh, 100%. Ignoring it entirely. So what happens is, entirely. No, this is what blew my mind, right? I really expected to see something different from what I read. So Lorimer, so there's this guy, Irvin S. Cobb, and he wrote, he created this character, Jay Poindexter, who is the black servitor to a local Kentucky judge, right? And whose name I'm now blanking on, the judge. But Lorimer sends a quick telegram to Cobb, who had already been to Europe once, and at the beginning of World War I, and he sends him back again. And Lorimer writes something like, I've seen the black soldiers, I think he saw them marching in Philadelphia or something, right? Like before they went off. And they might make a good story. Cobb goes over, he writes a story called Young Black Joe, which is a riff on, what's his name? The composer who wrote all the minstrel, Stephen Foster, thank you. Stephen Foster, Old Black Joe, right? So it's a riff on that. And Young Black Joe, so this story is supposed to be laudatory, but it also like recycles like the watermelon stuff, and he compares the soldiers to mules, and and he's like, and at the end of towards the end of this, he says, and now because of this, in the future, and he spells it out, the N-word will now just mean American or something like that. So he both shows the heroism, but then immediately recontains it back in, right? So after that, there is nothing about like the actual black soldiers. There's only this the kind of stuff that I was showing there. But I'll finish with this. Because of Cobb's article, this one article, he wound up like going with like black organizations that were, he was like kind of welcomed by black organizations at the time. And I found an advertisement for a song written by a black composer that's called Young Black Joe, and it's based on the story. So it's all really complicated that way. But so the quick answer is nothing. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Remy, for inviting me. I'm going to pick up my copy after this event. I have a question, just a general question, which I wrote down while you were speaking and what Kelly said and Jesse. It's more of a general question, right? What impact did the racially insensitive content of the Saturday Night Post have on the development of black modernity in contemporary setting today? Looking at it from the diaspora point of view, the African or the South American and Caribbean. Yeah. So what impact do you think it has today?
Today? Yeah. I think that's a good question. I have two kinds of answers. One is, there is still a Saturday Evening Post. So it went out of business in 1969. But then it was bought by this family in Indianapolis, and they restarted it. And they totally started it as an engine of nostalgia, of like Norman Rockwell, fuzzy, warm, white nostalgia, right? And when I got my contract for the book, I contacted the Post and said, I'm writing a book about the Post, and I want to use some images from the magazine. And I wrote, I'm not going to lie, this is what it's about, right? I mean, I didn't go into the whole thing, but it's like, I'm looking at George Horace Lorimer and how he like advocated. And so the image editor wrote back and said, so you're saying that your book is about how Lorimer was a racist and the Post promulgated segregation? I said, yeah. And I got back a one sentence, we'll pass on this project. So, but this actually goes into what I think is the real answer. And this goes back to what I was saying before. What the Saturday Evening Post did, along with it wasn't alone in this, but it was one of the most important engines of this. What it did at the time was deny the achievement and the humanity of the black artists, writers, and thinkers who were actually doing the work at the time, who are producing some of the work that we read today, right? And those efforts, I think, then feed into sort of the way that, what I was saying before, the way that modernism got taught in the United States for a whole long time, right? So for a very long time, if black literature was taught at all, it was taught as like a sociological, like it wasn't an aesthetic thing. It was taught as a piece of sociology rather than as something that's worth studying for it as a coherent body of work. And actually, in this book I'm working on now, a guy named Michael Bibby wrote a great essay, and he compares redlining to the way that black poetry was redlined by modernism. So I think that's the answer, is that what it means to us today is that we don't have the picture of the past that actually existed at the time, right?
Thank you for fruitfully confusing us and making us think. what I'm trying to make sense of is the repetition. And I'm thinking of that which cannot be metabolized. Okay? They keep trying to make some sense of
Yes.
this black thing.
Yes.
And they take it from every which angle.
Yes.
And Fanon speaks to that issue in terms of, and I think it resonates with your question, that there's an aspect of whiteness that projects into blackness to try and understand itself.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is part of that dynamic that kept going on and on here. Couldn't be let go. Fanon also speaks to the black as representing the denied humanity of the white. So you see those flashes of the soldiers marching, the beauty of the poem, and then you redline and you deny, and you start the whole cycle again and again. But black folks are human. And who is it? Langston Hughes, who wrote about I Too Am an American, okay? And they're sitting and they're watching and they're cultivating and they're working through their diversity, because there's an angle on the black Harlem Renaissance that says, some of those skin folks weren't our kinfolk, you know? But you see a diversity being worked out that continues down today. So the inability to metabolize, I think, was a perverse gift to say, we're struggling with this, it's not going to disappear, and to this day we continue to struggle with this. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I only have yes to say. I agree. But I will say that, right, Toni Morrison talks about, right, about this idea. And also just, paradigmatic to me is like Langston Hughes, the white paint, right, that requires the one drop of black to actually make it white. Yeah.
3 drops.
Was it 3 drops? 3 drops. The 3 drops.
Well, good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Vuyo. I'm one of Remy's friends as well.
Thanks, Remy.
So I am from South Africa, and I own a global TV network, and I'm coming from an international landscape in this conversation, so I'm quite intrigued to hear everything being discussed here. And from a storytelling and storyteller point of view, I'm quite intrigued on hearing your points and how we accurately depict history while being sensitive to the current times, right? So how are you looking at that and ensuring that you're sharing history as accurately as possible, but also making sure that you're quite sensitive in how it would be, received? And because I think I am a lover of learning about historical events, what happened in the past. But again, it's like, how do we make sure that when we're telling these stories today, we're as accurate but also sensitive in how we do that?
Can I say that I don't know? I mean, it's a great question, right? I debated about putting that newspaper image up there, right? Because it's horrifying, and my chapter on Blanche Goodman, she wrote her stuff within view of the Confederate cemetery that figures into at least one of her pieces, and about a mile from the bridge where 2 men were lynched at different times, right? I don't know how to tell that story sensitively, I guess, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, that's why I started by saying there's going to be some stuff that's not so cool in here. I just don't. I just want to tell the truth. I just want to tell the truth. Truth sucks. The past, Jameson is still right about this. History is Jameson, right? History is what hurts. History is what hurts. So, I genuinely hope that. Well, I hope that people will be offended by what they read in here because it's offensive. But I don't want to offend the reader. I want I want to teach and I suppose outrage the reader because, we're still living with this stuff today, right? I mean, it's not like it's gone, yeah. Mark Noonan, one of the stars of periodical studies. And actually, can I just say, there are so many stars of periodical studies in here, it's kind of exciting to me.
Well, yeah, no, everywhere, and all these questions have been so great. And when I emailed you, I said, "Wow, what a courageous book this is," for all the reasons that we've learned. But I just want to make a quick comment on the interesting point about recovery and reckoning. That your own great book of recovery is when Washington was in vogue, and it's it is a hidden in the magazines book that you recovered, but it's 1925. It's the same year as the centennial of the Great Gatsby, and they really need to go together. So this the important work, and when Washington was in vogue, there is a character that actually the characters talk about how ridiculous these representations are. So your work is it is rich and elaborate. In terms of reckoning, your title is your extended title is wonderful. And I had a question about the image. I don't think it's Norman Rockwell, but the Saturday Evening Post, which is America writ large at that time and still today, the war against black modernity. Right now, I'm sure all of you are reading Ta-Nehisi's quotes, the Message, and he talks a lot about how hard it is to write about uncomfortable truth, and we now have legislation to prevent uncomfortable truth. And you look at that image, and it's written right. So that's the contemporary question. So I guess the question is, what do what made you put that particular illustration? And I don't think it's Rockwell, right?
No, it's not. So actually, and then I do also want to talk about when Washington was in vogue. So thank you. The cover first. So when Columbia sent me the mock-up for the cover, it had the absolutely wrong. So we already had the title, and originally I wanted to call it "Creating Jim Crow America," and that's because it was a riff on the only other really comprehensive book. It was called "Creating Americans" or "Creating America" by a woman named Jan Cohen. It was published in the 90s, and I wanted to riff on that, creating Jim Crow America, right? But they were like, no, that doesn't work. So circulating, because it's magazines. And then for the subtitle, I wanted to make it really damn clear that this is not like some innocent endeavor that Lorimer is engaged in. That this is war. And I think I'm pretty sure I read it in here that it was a it's a multi-century race war, right? And George Horace Lorimer was like the minister of information or propaganda. That's what he was, right? The image, so they had the absolutely wrong image. I went online, I found that it's just a stock photograph, and I said, can you make it look like a Saturday Evening Post cover? And I think they did actually a really great job. But since you mentioned when Washington was in vogue, this is really how I came to this project. So when I was so all of you students here, why you should do your work carefully. So when I was a graduate student, I was working on my dissertation. It was about 4 little magazines published in New York in the teens and 20s and how they responded to the Russian Revolution. And my chapter on The Messenger, which was a Harlem Renaissance magazine, I looked at a series of articles called "These Colored United States," and I finished the chapter entirely, and I was ready to be done with it. But then I said to myself, "But this is a series. There are other series in this magazines. Maybe I should just go look at the other series." So I went back to the microfilm, because I did it all on microfilm. I went back to the microfilm. I printed out all these different serialized pieces to see if anything was pertinent to what I was doing. Last thing in my pile, the very last thing, was something that was called "The Letters of Davy Carr," a true story of colored Vanity Fair. And I start reading it fully with the intention of reading the first 3 pages and being done with it entirely. And then I realized that I was not reading a series of articles, I was reading a novel. Not only was I reading a novel, I was reading a good novel. So it was the find of my career. Like, I'll never do anything, honestly, I think more important than bringing this back into circulation. And ultimately, it was a John Jay student who helped me get it published, so that's a whole other story. In the chapter that you're referencing, there's a conversation about it's like called How the Negro is Portrayed in Literature, or something like that, right? And they go through a bunch of authors, and then the narrator says, and of course, we wrote off Hugh Wiley and Octavius Roy Cohen. We wrote them out of humanity altogether. And that, of course, sent me to this book, right? Because they're referencing something, like by saying of course, it meant that everybody knew who they were. Didn't have to say anything else about them, just here are the two names, of course we hate them. I'd never heard of them. So then I started looking, and that's what led me to this book, right? Is that of course. So students in here, the little tiny things can really, really matter.
So we're about out of time. I did want to ask one final question, if I may take that privilege.
I'm an Aries.
So we're out of time, I'm sorry. I just want to go back to one of the previous questions. You know, there's some question about, you know, contemporary institutional censorship, the censorship in particular of, you know, critical race studies or anything that smacks of that. In a world, essentially, in a scholarship where we are essentially not allowed to talk about America's racial history, where minstrelsy or Jim Crow cannot be the focus, how does this epoch of the Saturday Evening Post's history get presented?
It doesn't. No, it doesn't, right? Like, so to go back to, I mean, most people today, I mean, like, young people do not know the Saturday Evening Post, right? Older people will, I think, but what they'll think about is Norman Rockwell covers, right? That's really what most people know. So what, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but to go back to Kelly's point, the Saturday Evening Post has not reckoned with its own past, right? The Saturday Evening Post, as it's presented today, would fit very well in Ron DeSantis' Florida, right? I mean, it just would. So we take the spaces that we have and we use them as best as we can, right? I can say with certainty that I'm telling a true story here, or a bunch of true stories here. I hope I add to the record, and I hope I add to the reckoning.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I work in a school as well.
Please linger too after we're done, and
Yeah.
we'll talk with the author.
Oh yeah, I've got a few books if you want to sell, and I also have show and tell if anybody wants to look at the Post or.
Yes, of course. Thank you. I appreciate it. So as the banned book culture is happening and how they're erasing the African American history, I feel like as an African American myself, I feel like with the modern society, the division between African American versus Caribbean Blacks and African Blacks, I feel like is becoming more of a situation which I feel like the unhidden truth and the uncomfortable truth is becoming more predominant, where people are saying like, they're speaking more of their culture rather than embracing the trauma that, because it's uncomfortable, I feel like it's becoming more of like a downing, spiraling situation where it's being hidden under the rug versus being out there. So I just want to say, like, how, as a culture in this room in society, how can we continue to bring this more predominantly outside of the world? Because they were so quick to give this news every Saturday, but it's like, this is what we had to live live in 1920s, but now we're looking at it like, oh, African Americans didn't do anything. They were this, they were that, because of the rhetoric that was given before. So my question is, how can we bring the culture back up? Because we know the hidden truths, and because we know what power and money can get the person to tell their story versus our own story.
Ooh, that's a big.
If that makes sense, because it's like, I just say that because like the banned book culture, like they're doing it in Florida,
Yeah.
and I just feel like this kind of book, would it be like would it still be available in the next 10 years? I don't know. So like, would it be banned? You know, that's just
I
what
take it
would
as a
say.
point of pride if it were.
Yeah. So that's just what
No,
I would say.
I don't know if I have a real answer to that, but I'll say this, because it's just a part of what you're saying. And actually, I think this also maybe goes to sort of the interesting, I don't know if fracturing is the right word, the interesting diversifying of Latinx, like the voting public right now. I'm obsessed with the election like everybody else, right? But so I'll take this point from what you said. The Harlem Renaissance was very Caribbean. The Harlem Renaissance was very gay.
Claude McKay.
Right, Claude McKay. I mean, but the Harlem Renaissance was not, in any sense, produced by a monolithic block of people. What the Saturday Evening Post wanted to do was turn that diversity into a monolithic block and dehumanize it, right? So, and it's tricky because you know, unity is strength, but unity also can deny the diversity of a people, and so that's going to be right. Like it's going to be right. I mean, the same. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because you're basically saying, like, even though the Harlem Renaissance also had a mixture of a black pool, like it wasn't just African Americans
Yeah.
from slave descent, it was also Caribbeans and Africans. People fail to realize just because it's American history, they just assume that, oh, this is what it is because of the rhetoric of the Saturday.
Right, and I know we have to stop, so no, I just want to make one more point. The reason why we study the Harlem Renaissance today has a lot to do with the rise of black studies in the 1970s, right? And so when that happened, it was sort of to like make the claim that this literature was worth studying, right? And I think that early on there was a lot of sort of like presenting it as the vocalizations, I don't know what you want to use, of a sort of like of a people. Like that's a one people, and there was a need to do that, I think, to establish that field of study. But the truth is much more complicated, right? The truth is much more complicated. There were so many Caribbean writers and political activists. I mean, like where would to your point about marching up? I mean, where would the Harlem Renaissance be without Marcus Garvey? I mean, you know, there wouldn't be a Harlem Renaissance without Marcus Garvey, even if Marcus Garvey and the Harlem Renaissance people were. But you know, you couldn't have had one without the other. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.